Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I am Suzanne Hilser-Wiles, President of Grenzebach, Glier and Associates, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our webinar covering the Giving Institute's 2018 Annual Report on Philanthropy. GG+A is proud to have been part of the Giving Institute since its inception, and we thank its staff and volunteers for their work on this report. GG+A looks to this annual report for important information that helps frame discussions with our clients regarding opportunities and challenges in the sector. Our focus as a firm is helping clients make data-driven decisions customized for their unique environments, and that focus will guide our discussion today. We will begin with an overview of the data from the report led by Pat Watson, a Senior Vice President at GG+A and former Senior Vice President for University Advancement at Brown. Pat will be followed by Grant Forssberg, Knowledge Resources Manager at GG+A, who oversees research for clients and the firm. Grant will be discussing the phenomena of rage giving, something that garnered significant media attention during this last year. Finally, Jim McKey, Senior Vice President and a member of the firm's Senior Leadership Council, will look at giving in response to natural disasters. With each of these topics, our goal is to point out lessons that might be learned and applied, not only by those organizations whose missions closely align with these concepts, but also those who may not be as closely aligned, but are focused on creating innovative, timely solutions to fundraising challenges. Please submit your questions as we go along, and we will leave time at the end to answer as many as possible. And if anybody was doubting whether or not this was live, I think you might be able to hear the ambulances going by our Chicago office. So thank you again for coming here today. Pat. Oop.
Thank you, Suzanne. So this was a great year for philanthropy. For the first time, giving eclipsed $400 billion, $410 billion to be exact. The economy powered that growth. We typically see increased giving following a robust stock market, and hopefully we'll see a similar trend in 2018. The largest sectors were not a surprise: religion, healthcare, education, and the arts. What's noticeable to me on this slide is the upward trend since the tail end of the recession. For all of you who were in the business at that time, one of the hallmarks of our success at that time was stay close to your constituents. So those programs that stayed close to their donors, to their alumni, to their parents, to their community, during those years following the recession, are probably recipients of loyal donor gifts today. So I urge you to pay attention to that. So who benefited from this growth? While religion represented the largest portion of total giving, as we saw in the previous slide, growth over 2016 actually slowed. Mega gifts, like the gift from the Chan Zuckerberg family, accounted for significant growth to gifts to foundations. With a positive stock market, sectors such as higher education, arts, and healthcare are also growing. These sectors also typically continue and maintain their investment in advancement. Very important, and we'll talk about that in a second. International giving declined, and this could be attributed to some of the natural disasters that happened in the United States. Jim will talk about that in a few minutes. But let's reinforce who benefited from this growth in giving. Foundations, healthcare, public society benefit, education, and the environment. And again, as we said before, foundation growth was largely fueled by mega gifts from high net worth individuals. And who was giving? Giving from all sources grew: individuals, foundations, and corporations. For me, the biggest surprise was the growth in corporate giving, although foundation giving was important as well. One thing I would recommend is examining the intersections of these three entities. Individuals and their corporate and foundation connections could provide leverage for organizations small and large in order to take advantage of the connections between these. One example is an individual who happens to be a CEO of a company, or he or she might sit on a foundation board. So how do you think about the intersection of those relationships, especially when it involves the same person? We're also going to watch this year what the impact on the new tax policies are on all of these sources and who stands to be impacted the most. You've probably heard a lot of times is that you've got to spend money in order to make money. So how do we think about the investment in our advancement programs? While dollars have increased, participation is actually flat, one of the observations in the report. This could be considered a good sign that participation is actually not falling, but it also suggests that we're raising more money from the same donors, and we're not acquiring, or importantly, retaining enough donors to increase participation rates. And why is this important? We must invest in programs that engage the entire gift pyramid of prospects, not just one part of the gift pyramid. This contributes to both short and long-term results. Sustainable growth depends on predictable and appropriately sized budgets. So not over budgeted in one area, under budgeted in another area. And while we often see a large percentage of the budgets allocated to development officers, we often see critical programs like alumni relations and advancement services under budgeted. So what does that mean for both short and long-term success? So one of the ways I think about this, and I'm suggesting that you might think about it, is a two-prong approach to this type of this situation. As we said before, many times, dollars up, participation down, or flat. This slide represents a two-prong approach. One is to further deepen the relationships with the prospects at the top end of the gift pyramid, but also at the same time, we've got to build the middle and lower levels of the gift pyramid. Focused attention on the top prospects is as important as engaging the lower end of the gift pyramid, or our broad base. Oftentimes it's referred to as the broad base. I see this not as an either-or situation. I see this as both situations, both approaches are very important. So I also mentioned before that corporate giving is up, and I just want to use one example. So in their report on social responsibility, this is Southwest Airlines, they described an intentional use of their resources to both support local giving, disaster relief, community outreach, and national giving. We're also seeing many universities adapt their corporate relations programs to better integrate their strategies around research, around student recruiting, and also around economic development. Job creation, very important to universities in the locales that they live. They're also adapting some strategies where partnering with your organizations actually improves business practices and also reputation. Another example are museums are expanding the relationships with corporations way beyond sponsorship or underwriting of exhibits and events or galas. So there's a lot of different ways, and I encourage you to take a holistic approach to this relationship with a company or your relationships with an industry sector. I guarantee that probably there will be garnering more support from these particular companies, and especially maintaining the relationship as turnover occurs. Suzanne, that's...
Oh, thank you, Pat.
You're welcome.
So you mentioned the uptick in corporate giving as one area that was a surprise. Were there other surprises for you in the report?
Not so much a surprise, but it reinforced the notion that stewardship, donor relations, but especially stewardship acknowledgement at all gift levels, at all to all sources, is probably one of the most important things. Again, we talked a little bit about the impact of the tax policy. What is that going to mean this year for our lower and mid-level pyramid donors if they cannot deduct from their income tax? So again, donors have a choice. How are we demonstrating that appreciation for their gifts when they're making a choice to give to your organization? So I would say that the most important thing is stewardship, donor relations to all sources, individuals, foundations, corporations, and then I would also include government.
Great. Thank you so much, Pat. Grant will now talk to us about rage giving.
Okay.
Thanks, Pat. So this is a fun one. So this is a topic that's garnered a relatively high amount of media and popular attention compared to many other trends in philanthropy, not least of all because it's seen as an extension of the current political climate. And a lot of the narrative has dwelled on fitting that surge into that climate. And while the context is inseparable and is important and relevant, and there's even some survey evidence empirically backing that political progressives feel particularly compelled by this moment in time, there's a more fundamental aspect to this, and that's that skepticism towards government institutions has always been an outlet for participation in civil society in the United States. And I think I'm more interested in what we can say about how this participation is happening as opposed to what its ideological flavor is. And I don't think we need, as I'm sure everyone in this room and watching online knows, I don't think we need a retread of the causes at play and some of the partisanship conflict. I think in particular this includes the channels by which that giving is happening and what we can say about the need for agency and the feeling of donations having a discernible social impact. Supporting some sort of change to a system, research, for example, reducing the use of combustible fuels in the global economy, those kind of things. Unless you're an organization with a case made explicitly for this moment, it begs the question of what are some of the more industry agnostic takeaways from rage giving. So first of all, a banner year for civil society, if also one for rage, which I kind of touched on. Raging giving. Giving is bullish everywhere. Pat showed a number of slides showing that giving in the sector segments is up generally overall, 2-year average in almost all the different sectors. Public society benefits, the third highest subsector growth rate above the 5-year annualized average growth rates. 77% of civic affairs, rights, social, and economic justice receipts were higher at the same point in 2016. So we're not only seeing bullish giving tied to the stock market, we're also seeing some empirical quantitative evidence for what we're seeing anecdotally in the news when it comes to public society benefit giving. So case study, ACLU. 2 exemplars of the moment I'll get into, starting with ACLU. 300% spike in membership, 4 times increase in total private support. You see the online giving totals here. 1 million donors and the volume's 85 million. 24 million in online donations in one weekend following the proposed Muslim ban. And here are 2 case studies that kind of parallel that and follow a similar trend. The Women's March and the March for Science, we saw 5 million attend, 637 events, 2 million raised through crowdfunding channels. And also, as far as social media advocacy goes, the March for Science stemmed from disparate Twitter accounts. So there isn't a central source organizing or an organizational source, brick and mortar, organizing some of these events. And Science reported that they raised 1 million prior to the event happening. So what are some of the takeaways? It's a multi-channel world. We're seeing a sustained increase in online giving. And for your edification, here are a number of statistics related to that from reports covering that space. Blackbaud, M&R, and N10 and NRC are all reporting increases in various forms of email marketing, list acquisition, online giving, that sort of thing. So it's important, and I'm sure we're already talking about this trend generally, to be attuned to what's happening online and offering that channel for donations. Donations have agency in a time when agency is important. So cutting through, I think, the political lens, people give because they want to have an impact. I think we're in a time for reactive or impactful giving generally. I think this has been exacerbated since the watershed election a couple of years ago. But this is what the giving pledges and major gifts, especially mega gifts, come from. They're stemming from the want to enact social change and critiques of social systems. Now, whether those be as politicized as the topic of rage giving is often presented as, it could be something like climate change. It could be international development, things in that vein. People are stepping up when something is missing, be it social issues or government funding, which is also a topic that we see a lot of, including with the March for Science nonprofits talking about deficits in federal funding, and we're seeing that a lot, that as a talking point. So I think the takeaway kind of parallels a lot of what Pat was talking about earlier, acquisition and retention. And I think ACL is a good case here, and this is drawn directly from the Giving USA text. They sought to turn one-time donors, those donors that might come in through the door through, reacting to governmental policies, into long-term supporters and not making that a flash-in-the-pan thing, a one-time thing, by encouraging monthly giving. And then on the back end, taking advantage and mining the data they get from those interactions, doing follow-up research with large donors, honing communication strategy, continually doing that, and providing tools to help supporters engage in advocacy and direct action.
So, Grant, a number of the organizations that you cite can be seen as political. What advice would you give to organizations that want to take advantage of this phenomena but need to remain apolitical, like a public university?
So I think Meals on Wheels is actually a great example. They seized on the federal funding deficit and local. It all kind of glosses over and becomes one general funding issue. They had a windfall of fundraising, and that's, Meals for Seniors and At-Risk Populations is not particularly politicized per se. At least I don't think it is. Which brings me to my most immediate answer. And that's, I think that by looking at this strictly through the lens of being social justice oriented or being a political issue, we're narrowing our ability to make definitions to define how we connect to the larger social story. And I think everyone is doing something that connects to that larger social story. Education, that's a direct parallel, and you know acutely how state budgets have been going the past couple decades and the decline in state funding. That's a case that you can make that has parallels with the rage giving going on right now, and also is generally part of this social story. And education, that's institutional. I think education generally is a social issue as well as humanities and arts are related back specifically to funding.
Thank you. Early in my career, I was the director of external relations for Cancer Care, a wonderful organization that offers free support services for people with cancer and their families. And we would notice when a celebrity was diagnosed with cancer, we'd see a big uptick in traffic to our website. So we developed a process for responding to that. We would update the front page of the website to include information about their particular diagnosis. We would include expert advice from people who had some sort of connection to that celebrity's story. How do you see organizations can use these kind of cultural moments to help drive understanding and fundraising for their organizations?
I think the key word is responsiveness. The news cycle happens quickly. We're all aware of that. The channels that we're using, social media, that discourse happens really rapidly. So you have to have your messaging on hand, be ready, keep your content fresh and updated, as you mentioned. Don't just be reactive, be proactive on those channels as well and be part of that dialogue. And then on the back end, as I mentioned, you want to capture information about people you're having conversation with and donors that you engage, so this doesn't become a one-time deal, and that you continue to retain those donors and steward them along.
Great. Thank you so much. Now, Jim is going to talk to us about disaster relief.
Well, I have a topic that's both sad but also has positive things about how philanthropy provided relief and support for people who suffered. And this last year was one that many of us remember as being filled with many disasters. There were 2 months that had 3 major hurricanes, one after the other, that hit Houston, Florida, Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, and caused significant damage and even loss of life. Later in the year, we had wildfires in Northern California, followed by more wildfires in Southern California, we all remember watching the news and seeing the scary scenes from those fires, and lots of population affected and significant damage. So how did the world respond? How did Americans respond to that? Before we go into that, as one thing we wanted to ask you to do in the audience was to tell us about your own corporate giving, because the story that we have about disaster giving is that corporate giving really drove the increase in disaster giving. But in your programs, no matter what kind of organization you are, did your organization receive more than 10% of its support from a corporation? And we will address that response from the audience at the end of this particular segment. So thanks for taking that. I'll give you a couple more minutes to respond to that, a couple more seconds, let's say. Yeah, we're getting good response from the audience. Thank you very much. Okay, so as Pat noted, this was a big year for corporate giving, and Giving USA tied much of the corporate giving increase to disaster giving. You see that it was an 8% increase in the giving given by corporations over last year, and when you look at a 2-year time period, it was the second largest. So this is definitely noteworthy and was one of the highlights of the Giving USA report. However, just to moderate that feeling of exuberance about an 8% growth rate, it has been a great time for corporations. And as a percentage of pre-tax profits, we only had a slight uptick in the impact that this giving had on that measurement. We really have seen a longer-term decline in overall corporate giving as a percentage of pre-tax profits. We are all thinking about the year that we are in and what is the likely impact on giving. We know that the economy remains strong and that forecasts for profits are very positive. We also know it's unusual, an unusual circumstance this year is that it's the first year when corporations will benefit from substantial tax relief that happened in December 2017. So much is unknown. What we in the sector wonder is how much will we benefit, how much will our organizations benefit from a likely very positive climate for corporate capability to give. And I would just want to highlight again what Pat said, is that we individually as organizations need to be ready to take advantage of the likely growth in our particular situations by taking advantage of the existing relationships we had and understanding how to take a holistic approach that might support things like a corporation's brand sensitivity and awareness, their interest in recruiting our students if we're a university, and in our capabilities of providing research if we're a university or a hospital that does research. The amount of increase, $405 million, is a big increase, but we noted again that that was relatively flat as a percentage of pre-tax profits. Some of the trends that we notice in corporate giving is a focus on strategic philanthropy, that corporations understand that they can do well by doing good, and that there are expectations of companies that they play a role in society of being citizens and being important models to others. We found that there's been a lot of focus on corporations on our local community giving. And then some of the larger corporations, of course, have more national agendas. And we will see that when we talk about a specific case study in disaster giving. One expert noted, companies know they can build goodwill externally and internally through their giving programs. And in disaster giving in particular, we've seen that it has been an opportunity for a corporation to position themselves not only with their communities and the citizens of the communities affected, but also their employees. And that has become very important when you think about those lists of best places to work. This is one of the factors that many people seeking employment think about. Oops. So I wanted to talk about Hurricane Harvey as a case study of what happened in 2017. CNN reported that it was $157 million worth of direct support coming from corporations immediately following the hurricane, in the days following the hurricane. And that is a big number. And it included not only direct giving from the company, but also the matches that the companies made to their corporate, to their employee matching gift programs. And that was really big. Like many other fundraising, when we analyze fundraising results, we often look at the impact of large gifts. And you'll note that the Chamber of Commerce identified 69 corporations giving $1 million or more to hurricane relief with Hurricane Harvey in the days following that event. That's a big number. Many of those leaders were in the energy industry. We know that Houston is really the center of the energy industry in our country. So not only do they have headquarters, but many of them have plants and lots of employees. And so companies like Chevron, ConocoPhillips, Citgo, and many others step forward with gifts of $1 million or more. Another thing that we noticed was that another kind of corporation that we don't always think about are sports teams and leagues. And the sports teams in Houston and the leagues that they are a part of were very active in giving immediately following the hurricane. This was not only the teams and the leagues, but there was also individual giving with people associated with those teams. For example, the owner of the Houston Rockets made a $10 million gift to disaster relief. Many of us remember J.J. Watt, who is a football player for the Texans, being very visible in his own personal giving, in his willingness to organize fundraisers and be visible in that, and then maybe most importantly in being a visible volunteer for disaster relief in his community. And we also saw that kind of corporations organizing their employees to provide support for those who needed it in their communities, and that was another way that the corporations provided investment that was non-monetary. Finally, I note that there was a little bit of good news finally a couple of months later for the city of Houston when the Astros won the World Series. So they suffered a lot. At least they had a moment of celebration and joy coming later on. If we contrast this to what happened with Hurricane Maria, it's a pretty telling story. Hurricane Maria was primarily Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, Virgin Islands, and so on. And the giving for that hurricane from corporations was $24 million compared to the $157 million we saw in Houston for Harvey. And again, it was driven by a small number of high-level gifts. There were companies like Coca-Cola, Amgen, because there are pharmaceutical companies located in Puerto Rico, stepped forward with large gifts. But because there was not as much, there weren't as many corporations, and the population was just less visible, we're sad to say, than Houston as a major center of population, that the response was much lower than what we saw with Hurricane Harvey. It's just an interesting contrast. And yet, it's part of what's included in the overall big jump in giving. When we look at giving by sector, Giving USA thought that there was impact on this analysis as well. The decline in international giving, they believe, has a direct tie-in to the fact that many organizations, corporations, and individuals chose to focus on domestic support of those who were suffering as a result of the hurricanes and the wildfires and other disasters. So that was the only one that declined. And they think that there was some benefit to some of those other sectors like public society benefit and human services that benefited from people supporting them. Even animal welfare was very much in the news when we saw pictures of the animals who were suffering as a result of hurricanes or fires. So what is our number here? So by far a majority who say no, that you were you had less than 10% of giving from corporations. That's what we would expect. But actually there's a fair number of you who have received more than 10% of your support, meaning that this is a very important segment for you to be paying attention to. And I'll just have one comment on this, is that I was in conversation with one of my higher ed clients who noted that they have more than 10% of their giving in this particular year from corporations, but in their case it's not a repeatable thing, and that it was very much tied to fundraising for an athletic facility where the corporations wanted to be associated with a high-performing program, a lot of brand awareness, and they made substantial gifts for this athletic facility, but the vice president doesn't expect that to be repeated in the coming year.
Thank you, Jim. Corporate engagement is often a source of frustration for our clients, particularly the gap between what board members expect corporations should be giving and what's actually happening in the field. What are some of the things you could take away from this report if you're a development director to help educate people about the real opportunity of corporate giving?
I think there's a lot of data to be shared with board members about the true impact of corporate giving as compared to other sources of giving. The first data point that I would share would be that since the 1970s, corporate giving has been 5 to 6% of all giving. So we sometimes find a trustee who believes that corporate giving is the answer to our organization's need, and in many of our cases that just is not true. And that leads me to the second data point, which is that one of the early slides in the report has to do with the source of giving. And the source of giving, and Pat noted this, 70% of giving comes from individuals, but it's even deeper than that. 9% of giving came from bequests, which obviously are also individuals. And then in the foundation sector, a significant portion of foundation giving is estimated through their studies to come from family foundations, which really are individual giving. So Giving USA estimates that 86% of all giving comes from individuals. That's powerful data to share with a board member who might have a different idea.
Well, so now that you've been able to calibrate expectations, you've also painted a pretty rosy picture of corporate giving. So what advice would you take from the findings in this data to help grow philanthropic support from corporations?
I think that Pat pointed this out earlier, and I agree with her assessment, which is that those organizations that think in a holistic way about a revenue model where giving is just part of a deeper relationship with the corporation are those who are most likely to be successful. And that some of those things that we can be focused on are what do we have for value that can contribute to their brand? What is it about us that they want to be associated with? That's critical. But also more directly in how we serve their effectiveness as a corporation. Can we be training the next generation of employees for them? Can we be providing the research that drives their profitability? Those are very important things that we can do.
Great, thank you so much. Now we are going to take questions both from the room and online, so please do submit questions if you haven't previously. Andrew.
So we've heard some concerns about what individual giving might look like in the next year due to the new tax laws. Could you comment on what we might expect in the next year?
I'll repeat the question, and Jim, would you answer that for us? Sure. Thank you. We've heard a lot of discussion about what might happen with individual giving this year in response to the new tax law. What insights or direction can you give clients who are concerned about that?
Well, simple answer is we're not sure entirely, but we do have some history and some data points. One that is really focused on giving in the past when there has been tax reform, and the second one is on some internal research that we have done at GG+A. So the first one is that when there has been significant tax reform before, it often has been the case that in the year before the reform takes place, there has been a rush to giving. And we do have certainly anecdotal evidence that we have, that there were many people who made substantial gifts in the month of December as a result of anticipating changes in tax policy. And that has, in the past, has evened out. So even if there's a dip in the year following the reform, experience shows that that has tended to even out. And that gets to the second part, which is a question about, which is a comment about motivation, donor motivation. GG+A did a survey of 2,000 households rated at what we believed could give $100,000 or more in terms of capacity. And the finding was that 7 out of the 8 of those households said that tax reform had no impact on their decision making. So it's just some data points that we have, but in fact we still have to wait and see what happens.
Thank you, Jim. Other questions? Taylor?
So you've talked about the concept of rage giving. So what are other emotions that inspire significant giving?
So I'll field this one. So I think emotion, period, is emotional engagement is a goal, period. And I don't not too savvy on cognitive psychology, but when you engage someone emotionally, it's visceral and it's relatable to them, and that's a strong driver. I remember being in a composition class in high school where we went over forms of appeal: logical appeal, authorial appeal, emotional appeal. it's a defined appeal, whether in writing or in your messaging to donors. So I think engaging donors emotionally, period, is the goal.
Somebody just wrote in and said, could you repeat the question? The question was about, are there other emotions that can inspire rage giving? And as Grant has said, it's really about an emotional connection with donors. So we had a question that was tailor-made for Jim McKey. Jim, when we look at giving in higher education, how does that compare to trends we see in independent school giving?
So since I was talking about corporate giving, that's a place to start, is that independent schools have usually had almost no corporate giving, and so the discussion about that probably has very little impact on that. If they have corporate giving, it tends to be what Pat described earlier, which is really being driven by a particular donor who might be the owner of a company or the CEO of a company, or who may want to have some presence, and that is more of a vehicle for giving as opposed to a sector that they care about. But I think there are lots of similarities, actually. I'd say there are more similarities than differences, that independent schools are focusing on that kind of focus on the top of the pyramid that Pat was showing, but also knowing that they have to be building their pipelines for the future through their annual giving program. And the most successful programs are focused on retention as well. So, and then finally, I would say the comment about stewardship, that higher education has probably been a little bit ahead of independent schools, but independent schools are catching up rapidly in devoting resources to highly individualized stewardship programming.
Pat, we received a question about international donors to U.S.-based institutions, particularly in higher education. Could you talk a little bit about your experience engaging major and principal gift donors who are from other countries?
I can. Thank you. In my previous positions, we had a number of donors, both parents and alumni, who are both expats and also people from a particular company, or country rather. And so a lot of it was understanding how people can make gifts, and so the types of business vehicles that one needs to create in order for a gift to be made from outside the U.S. to a U.S. entity. So it was, there were things that were just not only areas not only understanding about what motivates somebody to give if they're outside of the U.S., but understanding how to give the gift as well. So it was a little bit more involved in terms of being able to receive gifts from outside of the U.S. But I believe that there are still commonalities, that people are motivated to support something that they really care about. And oftentimes when there isn't a tax incentive outside of the U.S., and we're still receiving large gifts, then you need to, it's good to examine that. But I think the motivations are what has been described before. And oftentimes with parents are interested in supporting an institution that, if it's a higher ed institution that their child is attending, as a gesture of support for the institution. And they're grateful that the student is there and having a great experience. So I think the approach is similar. I think also from the gift officer standpoint, it's really important for gift officers to understand money and money systems, and not just the U.S. dollar. So I think there's a additional education that's required in terms of how to give a gift and just understanding the environment that you're working with.
We received a question that's a fairly common. Oh, sorry, Grant.
That we actually, from the research side, getting a great insight from the practitioner side from Pat. A couple years ago, we actually did some research on transnational giving in a later 2015 copy of our quarterly review, which is conveniently available on our website. And it's difficult to track. Actually, outside of the United States, where giving statistics are captured with higher frequencies because we have a more robust civil society. Giving in the rest of the world happens at lower volumes, and oftentimes, obviously with state support and other factors, oftentimes I should say, the organizations like the Giving Institute and associations that capture that data here in the U.S. don't exist. Transnational giving, there's some resources in that quarterly view. That's a big question, is the legality, the vehicles to do it, the incentives. Transnational Giving Europe, I believe, is a resource out there for that. In terms of actually tabulating those gifts, the Department of Education also keeps a list of foreign donations to U.S. institutions that I believe is somewhere hidden away in their data clearinghouses.
I can add one more thing. So I think also what's really important is the value of the volunteer role. We haven't talked much about volunteers during this session, but I have found that volunteer roles outside of the U.S. are almost more important, and have found that in Asia and also in the UK.
We see that a lot in our independent school, foreign-born families, giving by example and having them ask and explain that that's part of the culture of being an engaged citizen of the school has really driven some very large annual gifts in particular.
And having somebody who can be your advocate with new families is very helpful. The final point I would make is that in a preview call that we had with some of the experts from the Lilly School at Indiana University, they noted that they are starting to track international giving more. So I would say in coming years we will have more data to be able to analyze.
We got a question that I'm going to give to the panel because this is a pretty common one. Since we have talked about the decline in the number of donors, somebody has asked, does it still make sense to do a traditional direct marketing acquisition program in order to bring new donors into the pipeline? We have a wonderful colleague, Adrian Salmon, who is a real expert in regular giving, which is what they call it, where he lives in the UK. And he gives lectures on this topic. I'll share what Adrian would say, but I would love, I'll channel Adrian. Adrian talks about the fact that it still does work. Data supports the fact that a multi-channel direct marketing program works. How much you do in each of the channels depends very much on the client environment, interest in investment, what kind of donors you're looking to acquire. But it is, in fact, a way that donors do build pipeline. And interestingly, with every generation, there's an idea that this type of outreach isn't going to work with the new generation of donors. And in fact, that hasn't borne out over the last 3 generations. We see a multi-channel approach continues to work. Now, that's an expensive way to go. So we know it's an important question for you to ask as in your institution as well. Other things you all would add to that?
Add that I would agree with you that it still works. In my experience, it still worked. And it's also a way to communicate. So it's not only asking for a gift at a certain level, it's also a way for the organization to communicate their message or a priority or news of various sorts. And so through a variety of ways of giving, through direct mail, sometimes you receive a direct mail piece. You don't make that gift through the direct mail envelope, but you often will go to the website or go to a different kind of site to make the gift. So it is also used as a communication vehicle.
At the same time, I would add, there have been some really creative solutions to donor acquisition in annual giving that would fall under direct marketing. Many of our clients have introduced days of giving that are incredibly creative. They'll do a global day of giving, again, talking to expats, talking to families that live abroad. And there are ways to engage them in exciting, interesting, fun ways. It goes back to volunteers. It's a terrific way to engage volunteers at all levels of your giving pyramid. So there are creative solutions, but the idea that we should reach out in multiple ways to the broadest possible group, that's the tried and true that we still see.
And there's also data that there are generational preferences for different channels, too.
Absolutely.
Keep that in mind.
Yeah. We are now just about at the end. We have time for probably one more question. So I will ask a question from our online panel. And this is for you, Jim. How can people be proactive in thinking about things like disaster relief or other things that incite a response? How can you be proactive? This tends to be very reactive. And are there things that they could do ahead of time?
I think that Grant spoke to that in a sense of talking about the readiness of sort of discussing situations that can occur, and that you're thinking about how do we get prepared for eventualities that we may not know. And some of it may just have to be about your own organization. What happens, what should we do if a natural disaster happens? Who is it who will get together to determine what our organization is going to say and how quickly, and how we're going to turn that into a message about giving? I think it's preparedness, even though none of us can really know what might come down the road. We can know that in the event something happens, it is this group that will be responsible for gathering quickly, for determining steps, for thinking about channels of communication, for distributing responsibility for different parts of your intended program. Those are some things I think of.
Great, thank you. We were asked via online if our slides would be available on our website, and they will. In addition, our three presenters have agreed to write a blog post that really encapsulates what they've shared with you today. I would also encourage you, if you have additional questions, please go online, and we will be answering questions over the course of the next few weeks, and appreciate your active participation in this. I'd like to thank you again for joining us. We hope you will check out our website for more information on topics related to the field. I'd like to thank our presenters and all of you for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you.